A lot of sequels ruin everything about the original, by either changing too much and making the game feel too different, or by not changing enough, keeping the game stale and repetitive. Hylics 2 is not one of those sequels. In fact, it's probably one of the best sequels I've ever played, which is saying something, as I've played quite a few fantastic sequels. Before watching this, I'd recommend watching my previous review of Hylics for some more context, alongside playing it if you have any interest. Unlike in my last video where I very much forgot to, I will actually provide a spoiler warning here for the final segment of the game, but I'd still recommend playing it. Anyways, I should probably start the actual video. Hylics 2 opens with Wayne waking up in his house and stepping outside. He then presumably realized that Waynes are not one man, but an entire species of seemingly identical clones of each other, residing in a place called the Wayne House. An elder Wayne named, Old Wayne lives at the top of the house. Speaking to him, alerts you that Gibby's followers are attempting to resurrect him, and that he must inform Blairol, the leader of the city of New Moldril, that this is happening. Once you shortly arrive at New Moldril, you discover Blairol has been kidnapped by the evil forces of Vuax and are being held in this edifice, which basically just means castle, if you're wondering. Pongorma lives in one of the houses and joins you if you speak to him. He supplies you with new metaphors, an object that allows you to traverse the area by gliding. Using them, you can reach Vuax's edifice. At the edifice, you find Datasmold there, who also joins you. After exploring the edifice and playing a strange arcade game that I'll elaborate on later, you reach Vuax and fight him. After defeating him, you can free Blairol. He explains that a fragment of Gibby known as the Gibbylet has been uncovered that can be used to revive him, and that it's imperative you retrieve it. He grants you the keys to his airship, which allow you to access the rest of the world. The area housing the Gibbylet is a large fortress known as Foglast, but it's surrounded by a force field being maintained by the Shield facility, so I just need to go there first. Right next to the Shield facility is a small branch housing Snosa, who's the final recruitable party member. After she joins you, you can enter the Shield facility, enter through the maze-like basement, and slay the giant worm Fonthin Trelpine to disable the shield. The rest of the plot section contains spoilers for the end of the game, so if you haven't played and care about spoilers, use the chapters feature to skip to the next part. The next area, Foglast, is a giant desert fortress that's extremely confusing to navigate. Eventually, though, you reach the fortress interior and have to defeat Odazier, the guy trying to resurrect Gibby, who also possesses the Gibbylet. You also have to fight his weird fleshy bodyguard Karsoro for some reason. After defeating him, he reveals that Gibby is basically already resurrected before dying. Pretty much immediately after, Gibby emerges from a sarcophagus and kills everyone in the party. Afterwards, Gibby raises a massive fortress known as the Hylics Xylem that begins emitting energy that corrupts the normal inhabitants throughout the game, turning them into mindless, randomly generated text-spewing monsters, much like in the original. Unsurprisingly, to beat the game, you have to enter the Hylics Xylem, and, for the third time, get to the end of a giant fortress. At the end, you meet Gibby and engage in intense combat with him. After finally defeating him, some weird crap happens and the game ends. I don't know why I expected this game to have a simple and comprehensible ending. Remember how the gameplay in Hylics is pretty mediocre? Well, that's another thing this game changed. Now the combat sucks! Oh wait, it's actually good? That's a surprise for an RPG I'm covering on this channel. But yeah, the combat in Hylics 2 is genuinely really good. It's a lot more complex than the original and there's a lot more going for it. This time, it's a lot more centered around status effects, which is an interesting twist I haven't seen too many RPGs use. But the main new mechanic in Hylics 2's combat is the charge up skill. I didn't find myself using it all that much, but I imagine you can do some pretty crazy stuff with it. Basically, if you use charge up and then another skill, the skill you use is a lot more powerful. Most enemies in the game drop antennas, and if you give them to a TV-headed guy in an optional area called TV Island, which is also where you learn charge up, you'll upgrade the charge up skill to buff your attacks more. So it pretty much just keeps getting stronger, so that's cool. The combat overall is just a lot better than the original game, it is legitimately challenging at points. Especially against the bosses, they're just so much fun to fight. So even if you don't really care for the visuals or plot, there's still a pretty fantastic RPG in it. Several mechanics in the original, like the Afterlife and Mean, return in the game. I don't feel like fully explaining them again, so go watch my Hylics review if you want to know how they work. But they're still here and are basically the same. But the main departure from the original in terms of mechanics is that Hylics 2 is fully 3D. Since the game switched from RPG Maker VX Ace to Unity, there's a lot more that can be done, as the overworld is a three-dimensional realm. It can be traversed in several more ways than just walking along a predefined grid. You can jump and glide, as I previously mentioned, and there's quite a bit of platforming to some of the areas. With a controller, it's a little janky, but it's still very fun to navigate around. It isn't too frustrating. But I will warn you, if all you have is a keyboard and mouse and no way to play with a controller, I would probably advise against purchasing this game, as the platforming is absolutely abhorrent with a keyboard and is incredibly difficult to do. But if you have a controller, it's honestly not that bad. There are 2 points in the game where there's a pretty dramatic departure from the game's usual style. One of them I think is okay, and the other one I hate. The first one that I think is okay is an arcade cabinet minigame that's used twice in the game, once in View Axis Edifice and once in a random cave you can find. The first one's required, but the second's optional, which I appreciate. It's basically a 2D platformer where you must navigate around large levels with several enemies and large amounts of coins, known as bones in this game, that you can find. I don't think they're terrible, but they're not that great. Much like with the 3D platforming, with a controller they're doable, but with a keyboard they're terrible. But even with a controller they're still not that fun and they're pretty frustrating. But they're used sparingly and aren't that long, which I definitely appreciate. However, the second minigame is one that really grinds my gears. It is thankfully completely optional, but there's a pretty fantastic reward you get from completing it that makes it feel like something you should probably do. You can access it by doing a couple of other optional things, and then going to one of the starting areas and using a bomb to drop into the dungeon, known as the Sage Labyrinth. Basically, it's a 3D dungeon crawler reminiscent of 80s and 90s games of the same genre, where you have to navigate a huge labyrinth filled with enemies and a couple of items. But it's so incredibly confusing and unfun to navigate, it's painful. To access most secrets and some necessary things to progress, you have to bump into walls like in classic Doom games, but the issue is in those games, where interactable walls would be is somewhat implied. They are not at all in the Sage Labyrinth. I'll stop complaining now, but if you decide to buy this game, unless you have godlike patience, don't bother with this area. Unsurprisingly, the visuals in Hylics are absolutely beautiful. Somehow Mason Lindroth managed to make the game even more visually pleasing than the original. The overworld animations are quite a bit smoother and look nice, as do the areas you traverse, but my favorite visuals in Hylics come from the battle sprites. In the original, most enemy sprites were okay looking, with a couple cool ones, but in the sequel, every single enemy sprite is animated, and they're absolutely hypnotic to look at. Practically every enemy's animations are stunning, but my favorites come from the bosses, which just look ridiculously good. I don't think I can describe this further, just go play the game or watch a playthrough and see them yourself. Remember how the music in Hylics is pretty mediocre? That's another thing this game changed. But the music Wait, didn't I already do this bit? Well, anyways, the music in Hylics 2 is absolutely amazing. It is legitimately one of the best soundtracks of any game I've ever played. It's just fantastic. Since you've been watching this video and hearing the music throughout, you're probably already aware of how good it is, but if you have the time, I implore you to listen to the soundtrack at some point, even if you've no interest in the game. It's really good. Hylics 2 is pretty fantastic. I know I spent a lot of the gameplay session complaining about it, but don't take it the wrong way. The issues in this game are heavily outweighed by how enjoyable and fantastic of an experience Hylics 2 is. Go play it. Bye.